Good day, friends, and welcome back to Conflicts of the Human Race. Today, I will tell you about the entire story of World War I 1914-1918. Now buckle up as we begin. On June 28, 1914, in the Bosnian city of Sarajevo, a single gunshot changed the course of human history. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife Sophie were making their way through the crowded streets in an open-topped motorcar. The royal couple had come to observe military maneuvers, unaware that Serbian nationalist Gavrilo Princip waited in the crowd with a loaded pistol. As their car took a wrong turn and slowed to reverse, Princip seized his moment. Two shots rang out across the square. The Archduke and his beloved wife lay dying, their blood staining the leather seats. In that instant, the spark was lit that would ignite the powder keg of Europe, setting in motion a conflict that would consume nations and claim millions of lives across 4 devastating years. The assassination triggered a diplomatic crisis that quickly spiraled beyond control. Austria-Hungary, backed by Germany, issued an ultimatum to Serbia demanding harsh concessions. When Serbia rejected several key demands, Austria-Hungary declared war on July 28, 1914. The alliance system that had been designed to maintain European balance now became a mechanism for continental destruction. Russia, bound by Slavic solidarity and treaty obligations, began mobilizing to support Serbia. Germany, honoring its alliance with Austria-Hungary, declared war on Russia on August 1st. France, allied with Russia, found itself drawn into the conflict when Germany declared war on August 3rd. The German military, following the meticulously planned Schlieffen Plan, demanded passage through neutral Belgium to attack France. When Belgium refused, German forces invaded anyway. This violation of Belgian neutrality brought Britain into the war on August 4th, transforming a regional dispute into a global conflagration. Within 6 weeks of the Sarajevo assassination, Europe's great powers were marching toward unprecedented carnage. As August 1914 dawned, millions of men across Europe answered their nation's call to arms with unprecedented enthusiasm. In Berlin, Paris, London, Vienna, and St. Petersburg, massive crowds gathered in squares and boulevards, cheering wildly as military bands played patriotic anthems. Young soldiers marched through flower-strewn streets, their uniforms immaculate, rifles gleaming, convinced they would be home before Christmas. Trains packed with troops departed from stations decorated with bunting and flags, while sweethearts, wives, and mothers waved handkerchiefs through clouds of steam. The propaganda posters proclaimed it a glorious adventure, a chance for heroism and national glory. Professional armies that had trained for decades finally had their moment. Officers polished their swords and checked their pocket watches, confident that superior tactics and fighting spirit would bring swift victory. Nobody could envision the horror that awaited. The old world of cavalry charges and gentlemen's warfare was about to collide catastrophically with modern industrial killing machines. This infectious war fever would soon give way to unimaginable disillusionment as the reality of 20th century warfare revealed itself. The German war machine rolled into action with mechanical precision as the Schlieffen Plan unfolded across Western Europe. Massive grey-clad armies swept through Belgium like a steel tide, their jackboots echoing through ancient cobblestone streets. The plan was audacious in its scope. Knock out France with a lightning strike through neutral Belgium, then pivot east to crush Russia before she could fully mobilize her vast but slow-moving forces. German divisions, some 1.5 million strong, advanced in carefully coordinated columns supported by horse-drawn artillery and supply wagons stretching to the horizon. Belgian fortresses at Liege and Namur, thought impregnable, crumbled under the thunderous bombardment of massive siege guns nicknamed Big Bertha. French and British forces rushed north to meet the German advance, but found themselves consistently outflanked and outmaneuvered. Town after town fell as the unstoppable German juggernaut pressed forward. Paris itself seemed within reach as government officials prepared to evacuate the capital. The plan that German strategists had refined for decades appeared to be working perfectly, promising swift victory and European domination. In September 1914, the fate of France, and perhaps all of Europe, hung in the balance along the banks of the Marne River. The German First Army, exhausted from weeks of rapid advance, had come within sight of Paris's suburbs. French commander Ferdinand Foch rallied his forces for a desperate counterattack, famously declaring, "My center is giving way, my right is retreating, situation excellent, I am attacking." The Battle of the Marne became a clash of entire nations' destinies. Fresh French reserves, some transporting from Paris in commandeered taxicabs, joined the savage fighting along a front stretching over 300 miles. British Expeditionary Force units, though battered from earlier engagements, stood firm alongside their French allies. For 6 critical days, the battle raged across rolling countryside now churned into mud and blood. German forces, their supply lines overstretched and communications breaking down, began to waver. The Schlieffen Plan's perfect timetable fell apart as stubborn resistance and tactical mistakes accumulated. Finally, German commanders ordered a general retreat to more defensible positions along the Aisne River. The miracle of the Marne had saved Paris and changed everything. After the Marne, both armies began a deadly phenomenon that would define the war's character: the race to the sea. Neither German nor Allied commanders could accept stalemate, so both sides attempted to outflank each other by extending their lines northward toward the English Channel. What began as mobile warfare rapidly transformed into something far more sinister. As autumn rains soaked the battlefields, soldiers on both sides began digging protective trenches, initially as temporary shelter. But temporary became permanent as machine gun nests and barbed wire made frontal assaults suicidal. By November 1914, an unbroken line of fortifications stretched from the Swiss border to the North Sea, creating a 400-mile scar across Western Europe. The trenches grew deeper, more elaborate, more permanent. Communication trenches connected front lines to rear areas. Underground bunkers provided shelter from increasingly accurate artillery. What had begun as simple ditches evolved into complex underground cities where millions of men would live, fight, and die for the next 4 years. The Western Front had crystallized into a deadly maze that would consume a generation. While Western Europe descended into trench warfare, the Eastern Front exploded into massive campaigns of movement across the vast Russian Empire. Russian forces, mobilizing faster than German planners had anticipated, launched invasions into East Prussia and Austrian Galicia simultaneously. The Russian steamroller, as propaganda called it, initially achieved stunning successes against Austrian forces, capturing the fortress city of Lemberg and taking hundreds of thousands of prisoners. However, in East Prussia, Russian fortunes turned disastrous. German generals Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff orchestrated one of military history's most complete victories at Tannenberg in August 1914. The Russian Second Army, commanded by General Samsonov, advanced into a carefully prepared trap. German forces encircled the entire army in the Masurian forests, capturing 92,000 prisoners while killing or wounding 78,000 more. Samsonov, overwhelmed by the catastrophe, took his own life in the forest. The victory made Hindenburg and Ludendorff national heroes and eliminated the immediate Russian threat to German territory. Yet despite this triumph, the Eastern Front remained active, drawing German divisions away from the decisive Western theater. The year 1915 brought desperate attempts to break the deadlock through new theaters and revolutionary tactics. The Gallipoli campaign represented Allied hopes to knock Ottoman Turkey out of the war while opening a supply route to Russia. On April 25th, Australian, New Zealand, British and French forces launched amphibious assaults on the Gallipoli Peninsula under Turkish guns commanding the heights. What planners envisioned as a swift victory became 8 months of horrific trench warfare in impossible terrain. Anzac troops clung to narrow beachheads under constant sniper fire and artillery bombardment. Turkish forces, commanded by the brilliant Mustafa Kemal, defended every ridge and ravine with fanatical determination. Dysentery and other diseases killed more men than bullets. Supply ships became floating hospitals as casualties mounted into the hundreds of thousands. Meanwhile, on the Western Front, French and British offensives at Artois and Champagne achieved nothing but massive casualty lists. The Germans introduced poison chlorine gas at Ypres, opening a new dimension of horror. By year's end, military leaders faced the grim reality that this war would not end quickly or cheaply. February 21, 1916, marked the beginning of the longest and bloodiest single battle in human history, Verdun. German Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn chose this ancient French fortress city for a battle of attrition designed to bleed France white. The German assault began with a 10-hour artillery barrage from 1,400 guns that could be heard 100 miles away. Shells fell at a rate of 100,000 per hour, transforming the landscape into a moonscape of overlapping craters. French defenders, caught off guard, fell back as German stormtroopers advanced behind the rolling barrage. Fort Douaumont, keystone of the French defensive system, fell within days. France seemed on the verge of collapse until General Philippe Pétain took command, organizing supplies along the Sacred Way, the single road keeping Verdun alive. For 10 months, over 700,000 French and German soldiers fought in conditions that defied description. Artillery transformed ancient forests into fields of splinters and mud. Entire villages vanished from maps. Men lived in shell holes filled with corpses and rats. When the battle finally ended in December, both armies had bled themselves nearly to death for a few square miles of devastated earth. As Verdun raged, British forces prepared their own offensive along the River Somme to relieve pressure on their French allies. General Douglas Haig planned a massive breakthrough using citizen soldiers of Kitchener's new army, volunteers who had answered their country's call in 1914. The battle began July 1, 1916, with a week-long artillery bombardment intended to destroy German defenses. British gunners fired 1.5 million shells, creating a thunderous symphony of destruction that shook the earth across northern France. At 7:30 a.m. on July 1st, whistles blew along 18 miles of front as 120,000 men went over the top in the largest single attack in British military history. Officers had ordered the men to walk, not run, toward German lines, expecting to find only shell-shocked survivors. Instead, German machine gunners emerged from deep bunkers that had survived the bombardment and opened devastating fire on the advancing waves. By nightfall, 60,000 British casualties littered the battlefield, including 20,000 dead. It remains the bloodiest single day in British military history. Yet the battle continued for 4 months more, ultimately gaining 6 miles at the cost of over 1 million casualties from both sides. The war's maritime dimension intensified dramatically as Germany unleashed unrestricted submarine warfare in 1917. German U-boats, sleek predators of the deep, prowled shipping lanes around the British Isles, sinking merchant vessels without warning. The submarine's primary weapon was the torpedo, a self-propelled explosive that could send even the largest ship to the bottom in minutes. Britain, dependent on imports for survival, faced potential starvation as sinking rates soared. Merchant sailors became frontline warriors, knowing each voyage might be their last. The sinking of passenger liner Lusitania in 1915 had already demonstrated U-boat ruthlessness, but now no vessel was safe. German submarine commanders targeted grain ships, oil tankers, and any cargo that might aid the Allied war effort. Convoys protected by naval escorts became the Allied response, turning the Atlantic into a chess game of hunter and hunted. Depth charges, underwater explosives designed to crush submarine hulls, gave surface ships a fighting chance. The battle for control of the seas would prove decisive, as America's entry into the war depended largely on Germany's submarine campaign. Each torpedo fired brought the conflict closer to its ultimate resolution. On April 6, 1917, the United States entered the war, transforming the global balance of power. President Woodrow Wilson, who had campaigned on keeping America out of European entanglements, finally asked Congress for a declaration of war after Germany's resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare and the infamous Zimmermann telegram proposing a German-Mexican alliance. American doughboys began training at camps across the nation while factories retooled for wartime production. The American Expeditionary Force, commanded by General John J. Pershing, faced the monumental task of transporting 2 million men across U-boat-infested waters to European battlefields. Unlike their exhausted European allies, American forces brought fresh energy and optimism to the stalemated Western Front. Pershing insisted on maintaining American units as independent forces rather than feeding replacements into depleted British and French divisions. American industry, the world's most productive, began churning out weapons, ammunition, and supplies on an unprecedented scale. Liberty ships carried American wheat, steel, and manufactured goods to Allied ports. The arrival of American forces provided not just military reinforcement, but psychological renewal to war-weary European populations who had endured 3 years of unprecedented carnage. In Russia, military disasters and economic collapse fueled revolutionary fires that would reshape the world. Tsar Nicholas II, increasingly isolated and incompetent, had taken personal command of Russian armies just as they suffered catastrophic defeats. By 1917, Russian soldiers were deserting en masse, often lacking rifles, ammunition, and basic supplies. Bread riots in Petrograd escalated into general revolution as workers and soldiers joined forces against the autocracy. The February Revolution forced Nicholas II to abdicate, ending 3 centuries of Romanov rule. Alexander Kerensky's provisional government attempted to continue the war effort, but Vladimir Lenin's return from exile in a sealed German train changed everything. Lenin's promises of peace, land, and bread resonated with war-weary Russians. The October Revolution brought the Bolsheviks to power, and Lenin immediately began negotiations for a separate peace with Germany. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed March 3, 1918, removed Russia from the war but freed dozens of German divisions for transfer to the Western Front. This massive reinforcement would give Germany one final chance to achieve victory before American strength could tip the balance irreversibly toward the Allies. Germany's final gamble began March 21, 1918, with Operation Michael, the last great offensive of the war. Erich Ludendorff, now effectively Germany's military dictator, concentrated 76 divisions for a breakthrough attempt before American reinforcements could reach full strength. German stormtroopers, elite assault units trained in infiltration tactics, led the attack following a devastating 5-hour artillery barrage using both high explosive and gas shells. The offensive initially achieved stunning success, punching a 40-mile gap in British lines and advancing deeper than any attack since 1914. British Fifth Army collapsed under the German onslaught as entire divisions were surrounded and captured. Ludendorff's forces pushed toward Amiens, the crucial railway junction that connected British and French armies. For the first time since trench warfare began, open country battles resumed as cavalry and mobile units exploited the breakthrough. Paris came under long-range artillery fire from German superguns, creating panic in the French capital. However, German advances outran their supply lines while Allied resistance stiffened. Fresh American divisions rushed to threatened sectors, their arrival providing crucial reinforcement at the moment of maximum danger. The spring offensive would prove Germany's last throw of the dice. By summer 1918, the German offensive had exhausted itself against strengthening Allied resistance. American forces, now arriving at 300,000 per month, proved their mettle in fierce fighting at Château-Thierry and Belleau Wood. Marine units, fighting alongside French forces, earned legendary status by clearing German positions from heavily fortified woodland with bayonet and rifle. The tide was turning as Germany's manpower reserves dwindled while Allied strength peaked. Ferdinand Foch, appointed Supreme Allied Commander, began planning coordinated counteroffensives using fresh American divisions as spearheads. The Battle of Amiens, beginning August 8, 1918, marked the beginning of Germany's final collapse. British, Canadian, Australian, and French forces, supported by hundreds of tanks and aircraft, smashed through German lines in what Ludendorff called the Black Day of the German army. Entire German divisions surrendered without serious resistance as morale crumbled. The Hindenburg Line, Germany's supposedly impregnable defensive system, began to crack under relentless Allied pressure. German newspapers could no longer hide the military situation from their readers. The homeland faced starvation while the army retreated on all fronts. Revolution beckoned in Berlin as it had in Petrograd. September 1918 witnessed the collapse of Germany's alliance system as her partners sued for separate peace. Bulgaria signed an armistice on September 29th, opening the Balkans to Allied advance. Ottoman forces, decimated by British campaigns in Palestine and Mesopotamia, could no longer defend their empire's heartland. The Young Turk government fell as Enver Pasha fled to Germany, leaving Turkey defenseless. Austria-Hungary, the original aggressor, disintegrated as constituent nationalities declared independence. Czechs proclaimed their republic, while Yugoslavs united under Serbian leadership. Hungarian revolutionaries overthrew the monarchy as Emperor Karl desperately sought American mediation. The Habsburg Empire, which had ruled Central Europe for centuries, simply ceased to exist as German-speaking Austria became a small republic. Italian forces, reinforced after their disaster at Caporetto, won decisive victory at Vittorio Veneto, capturing 300,000 Austrian prisoners and ending resistance on the Alpine front. Germany stood alone, her army in retreat, her navy in mutiny, her people starving behind an ever-tightening blockade. Kaiser Wilhelm II, the monarch whose policies had triggered global catastrophe, faced the same revolutionary forces that had toppled his cousin Nicholas II in Russia. Revolution erupted across Germany as military defeat became undeniable. Naval mutinies at Kiel and Wilhelmshaven spread to army units and civilian populations. Workers' and soldiers' councils, modeled on Russian Soviets, seized control of major cities. Kaiser Wilhelm II, abandoned by his generals and facing possible execution like his Russian cousin, fled to neutral Holland on November 9th, ending the Second Reich. Social Democrats proclaimed the German Republic, while communist revolutionaries, led by Karl Liebknecht, attempted to establish a workers' state. Matthias Erzberger, representing the new German government, received impossible armistice terms in Marshal Foch's railway carriage in the forest of Campigny. Germany must evacuate all occupied territories, surrender vast quantities of military equipment, accept Allied occupation of the Rhineland, and maintain the economic blockade that was starving her people. The terms were harsh beyond German expectations, but continuation of war meant certain invasion and possible dismemberment. At 11 a.m. on November 11, 1918, guns fell silent along the Western Front for the first time in 4 years. Soldiers on both sides emerged from trenches to witness the sudden, miraculous quiet that settled over the devastated battlefields. The guns fell silent at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, but their echoes would reverberate through history. Across the Western Front, an eerie quiet settled over landscapes that had known only violence for 4 years. Soldiers who had lived in constant fear of death emerged from trenches to gaze across no man's land with wonder and disbelief. Some fraternized with former enemies, sharing cigarettes and family photographs. Church bells rang in Paris and London, while crowds gathered to celebrate in streets that had known only mourning for too long. Yet joy mixed with profound grief as communities counted their losses. Entire villages had lost their young men. Families mourned sons, fathers, and brothers who would never return from the mud of France and Belgium. The lucky survivors bore invisible wounds that would haunt them forever. Shell shock, now known as post-traumatic stress disorder, affected millions who struggled to readjust to peaceful life. The world they returned to had changed irrevocably. Empires had fallen, new nations had emerged, and social structures had been shattered. Women who had worked in munitions factories and driven ambulances would never again accept purely domestic roles. The old certainties lay buried in the military cemeteries that dotted the European landscape. The peace conference that convened at Versailles in 1919 faced the impossible task of rebuilding a shattered world. The Big Four, Wilson of America, Lloyd George of Britain, Clemenceau of France, and Orlando of Italy, brought conflicting visions to the negotiations. Wilson sought a just peace based on his 14 points and League of Nations. Clemenceau demanded security and revenge against Germany. Lloyd George balanced between American idealism and French vengeance while protecting British imperial interests. The resulting treaty imposed crushing terms on Germany: loss of all colonies, massive territorial concessions, severe military restrictions, and Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, requiring Germany to accept full responsibility for the war and pay enormous reparations. New nations emerged from imperial ruins: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and the Baltic states gained independence. The Ottoman Empire was dismantled, creating new Middle Eastern mandates. Austria-Hungary disappeared entirely, replaced by smaller successor states. Yet the peace settlement contained seeds of future conflict. Germany felt humiliated and betrayed. Russia, excluded from negotiations, nursed grievances about lost territories. Colonial peoples who had supported the war effort found their aspirations for independence ignored. The League of Nations, Wilson's beloved creation, would prove too weak to enforce the peace it was designed to protect. World War I transformed human civilization more profoundly than any previous conflict. The death toll reached staggering proportions. Over 8.5 million military deaths, 7 million civilian casualties, and millions more wounded in body and spirit. Four great empires, German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman, had vanished from the map. Technology accelerated warfare beyond recognition, introducing tanks, aircraft, poison gas, and industrial-scale killing. The war's economic cost bankrupted European treasuries and shifted global financial power to the United States. Socially, the conflict shattered class structures and traditional gender roles. Women gained political rights, while aristocracies lost their grip on power. Culturally, the optimistic faith in progress that had characterized the pre-war era gave way to disillusionment and modernist experimentation. The peace settlement, rather than ensuring lasting stability, created new tensions that would erupt into an even more devastating conflict within 20 years. The Great War, as contemporaries called it, was supposed to be the war to end all wars. But instead it became the first chapter in a century of unprecedented violence and upheaval that reshaped human destiny. If you liked today's story, make sure to check out our other videos on our channel. Have a nice day.